All right, on to the next part of this exposition on the Bronze Age collapse, on the Canaanite conquest, which are the same things as we have been showing. And at this point, I want to discuss with you two preludes to these events of the Bronze Age collapse. And these are the Siege of Troy and the Battle of Kadesh. And Kadesh took place about 100 years earlier than the Bronze Age collapse, in 1279 BC. And Troy actually was most likely part of the Bronze Age collapse. I'm not going to go too deeply into it because it's a major subject in itself, and you'll have to read up about it yourself. But what I want to show is that it is directly related to the Bronze Age collapse and the Battle of Troy, of course. And I think for everybody who is interested in history, the Battle of Troy is, yeah, really mythical and mystical event. It's really at the outer edges of what we know of history, and Homer is a perfect example of a certain mixture of myth and history. And that does not mean, by the way, that I reject or think that Homer should be rejected as a very important source, because people severely underrate the kind of sophistication that our forebears had. And also in the Bronze Age, you had really incredibly sophisticated people. And Homer most certainly also was one of those. And these people were living simply in very different times than we do, and things were different then. And Homer is not just making stuff up. And okay, but at any rate, we are at the outer edges of what we know of history, and this is why it's also very fascinating. And it's good to know and to realize that Troy and the Bronze Age collapse happened in the same time. And nowadays you can see it here. There are several estimations of the date of the event by different sources throughout history, and you can see that's anywhere between 1135 BC and 2 centuries later, 1334 BC. So, you know, similar problems as with Moses himself. People place them in different places in time, but nowadays many people believe that the Battle of Troy, the Siege of Troy, was a prelude to the Bronze Age collapse. And let's have a look at this square here again, share here again. Greece, or at any rate, the Mycenaeans. These Dorians here, they attacked, but they attacked, it was not all done in a few years, as opposed to Canaan and the Promised Land. Those events really were done in, they didn't take decades, although they were not a matter of one campaigning season. As you can easily see, this cannot be done in one campaigning season. These are all strongholds that needed to be sieged, and which took time to take, travel, recovery of the soldiers, new supplies, etc. This could not have been done in one day. This took a couple of years of constant campaigning, and this was also very much the case in. But still, it was a straightforward process. It was a straightforward process. This seems to have taken longer and seems to have started earlier also. These invasions by the Dorians, and they would come in and take out one place or maybe two, and then leave again with their loot, and then come back years later often. And this process, of course, weakened the Mycenaean Empire severely and eroded its strength over time. And simultaneously, or at any rate at some point in this process, they were also involved in the invasion of Troy. And this must have been quite a major event, although there are no neighboring, no sources from their neighbors who talk about the Trojan War, which is why for a long time people actually wondered whether it actually happened. But and this is a point that I want to make. This is common. This is constantly the situation. You would perhaps expect that neighboring states and neighboring sources would talk about things happening in Troy, what Israel was up to in the Promised Land, but it's not a given that they do, not at all. And this also happened in Troy very much so. That's why it's still a very, yeah, an event shrouded in mystery. And but at any rate, what is important and relevant is the understanding that Troy was an event part of the Bronze Age collapse, and therefore also simultaneously contemporary to the Canaanite conquest. And yeah, it gives you a good idea of what time frame we're actually talking about. And Troy definitely is one of the very oldest events that we have any serious information about, and this is true also of Kadesh, and that's what I want to leave it at here for now, bar one point, and that is propaganda, because we will see this very much so in the case of Kadesh, but also in the event of Troy. The simple fact is we have a Greek source about these events, Homer, and he is likely to have been on the side of the Greeks. And there also must have been a Trojan part to a story to their part in these events, and we don't know of that story. And this seriously colors the perception of events. And this is also clear from what we'll see here next. And this may sound like an open door, but I have to kick it in because this is also very much influencing the historical fog, the fog of history, the fog of war that surrounds the events in the Bronze Age collapse in Canaan and the wider area, you know, which is why this confusion about the Canaanite conquest and the Bronze Age collapse being the same events can even exist. Okay, so that's about the Battle of Troy, and next on to Kadesh. And this looks something like this here. This is the Hittite Empire with Hattusa the capital, and here is Egypt. And Hattusa, the Hittites were led by Muwatalli II, and Egypt was led by Ramesses II. And Egypt had been going through a period of growing power, and it was already an empire in the sense that both the north and the south had been united in the Egyptian empire. But the next age of conquest and expansion for the Egyptians came in Canaan. And this had been ongoing throughout the 14th century before Christ, basically, because this was a slow process. And what basically happened is that it is not true that Egypt just moved in here and took over the whole thing in the sense of that everything became Egyptian. It was more like they would go on a campaigning season. In a campaigning seasons, they would cross the Sinai and invade Canaan and attack this or that stronghold. And then either these places were beaten in battle, but often also they simply surrendered and bowed to the greater power of Egypt, and then became tributaries of Egypt. And then this happens to the different peoples who live in this area, the Amorites and the Hittites and the Canaanites. These are three peoples known to have lived in Canaan at this point. And they became tributaries to Pharaoh and under the sphere of influence of Egypt. So that's why this is green here. But this is not the same as the situation here in Egypt itself, where the Egyptian state has a very direct, centralized control over its people. But this growing sphere of influence in Canaan led to the Hittites and the Egyptians gaining a common border, and growing Egyptian influence was becoming threatening to the Hittites, and the Hittites undoubtedly were an obstacle to the Egyptians for further expansion here. And therefore Ramesses II decided he was going to attack the Hittites. And this is also a point. These Bronze Age empires, there was a long-standing equilibrium between them. And this was not a result of peaceful intentions so much. This was really a matter of limited technological, you know, potential of these empires. They were still in the Bronze Age, so, you know, supply lines and those things. We will see in this battle also that these supply lines of Egypt here for the Battle of Kadesh were really about as far as it would go. And this was a problem in this conflict. And but that Egypt is now neighboring this other empire is almost guaranteed to lead to war at some point. And this is what happens. And okay, and the weapon of choice in this era was a chariot with archers on them. And all these empires had them, the Assyrians, the Hittites here, the Egyptians, the Greeks also. And these were highly mobile, and because of their archers, they could, you know, throw their missiles on the enemy from a distance, and this gave them a huge advantage in on a tactical level against people on foot. Hoplite, like okay, these were not really in existence yet, but spearmen, people like you know, soldiers with these weapons, they could easily be attacked from a distance, and then every time they tried to close in, they would get out of there, and that's why these chariots were so mighty. And the major empires had thousands of them, and the Battle of Kadesh is famous because it is the biggest chariot battle ever. It was basically the Kursk of its day. Literally thousands of chariots on both sides were involved in this battle. And yeah, okay, of course it was for Ramesses as the aggressor, it was a matter of personal prestige. He was a major warlord, a big emperor, and you know how it goes, personal honor and glory, yada yada, and make a name for himself and posterity. That's what it's all about with these types. And for Muwatalli and his empire, it was really a huge test. And Muwatalli had to, you know, bring together all his resources and call in all favors. And he wrote to all his vassals, all his tributaries, which he would have had in these areas here. He would have similar tributary relations as Pharaoh here and here perhaps. And he called in all these favors and assembled a mighty force that was able to repel Ramesses's invasion. That's basically what happened. And Ramesses was not really destroyed, but he could not seriously threaten or unhinge these positions of the Hittites at Kadesh or elsewhere on the border. So next, he famously went home and he declared victory. That's what he did. He left a famous statement saying that he gained a beautiful victory and that the Hittites had been crushed, and well, that he gained major glory. And the same thing did Muwatalli II of in Hattusa. He also said he gained a splendid victory, and he was probably a little more right, because this was a very dangerous invasion for the Hittites. So they were probably mightily relieved that they won, and or at any rate survived in the battle. And but basically it was a stalemate. There has been a debate ever since who was right, who won. But the fact of the matter is that Ramesses was not destroyed in this battle. He remained a powerful monarch, and his army remained intact, and his control over Canaan remained intact, very importantly. So, you know, this, and at the same time, all the Hittite positions in the south here, in the north of Canaan, in the Levant, remained Hittite territory. So that is, you know, indicative of a stalemate. Such an outcome must have been preceded by some sort of stalemate. And so this is what happened. And what also happened famously is that Kadesh resulted in the first peace treaty known to history. And it was promises of eternal peace between them, as it always goes. And well, this did not last. In the decades after this peace in 1279 of Kadesh and this Battle of Kadesh, there were constant skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Hittites, and we have other sources in which they brag of the Egyptians brag of attacking the Hittites. So that's what happened, and it is very relevant for our tale. Okay, it happens 100 years earlier, but it shows a bit of the weapons of war. It shows a bit that were in use at the time. Also, still by the time that Israel invaded, and it also shows the propaganda and the different sides that you know, these people, these different peoples have in these conflicts. And they basically told a completely opposite the story. Ramesses went home and declared victory, and so did Muwatalli. So who was in the right? Nobody was. Maybe Muwatalli a little bit more than Ramesses, but it basically was a stalemate, and that's it. And this again happened with Israel also. And for instance, we have no Egyptian records of Israel, even in the period that I've already showed you, 1000 BC, that Israel is a major kingdom here and very influential in the region, still under completely supreme control of the entire Promised Land, because, okay, these states are all only here, but it's a dominant state, let there be no doubt about this at this stage. And there are no Egyptian records of this era and mentioning Israel whatsoever. In fact, there is only one record which mentions Israel in all of Egypt's thousands years old archives, and we will be coming back to that one record. So that is what happened in Kadesh, and this was then also the political situation that Joshua invaded a century later, because nothing much had changed here. These peoples were still mostly under the influence of Egypt, although it is probably also fair to say that this influence was already waning at the time, because the Sea Peoples here from Libya had been attacking since 1200 BC, and on the whole there was a decline in Egyptian fortunes and fortunes of all these empires here and all these kingdoms and tribes and cities. Okay, and because that's another thing that is good to understand, is that the basic mode of living in those days is fortified cities who are pretty much independent. And this is how everybody lives around all these coasts in the Mediterranean, but also much further away. There are always strong strongholds with high walls where people can flee, and then these cities have some surrounding area for agriculture, and some hamlets, some villages, and in times of war, all these people come into the city to find protection there. And an empire is basically a collection of these cities. That's how the Assyrians, you know, the Assyrian Empire, basically, the Assyrian empires also, all of them began with some king in some town in one of these ancient cities, and then gaining enough prestige and military power to start taking over control of these neighboring states, and that then becomes an empire. And the Dark Age is when all these empires, decline, and then people go back to these to the mode of independent local communities. That's basically how statecraft and empire and local autonomy and local social and economic relations were like. And it was quite a universal, this makeup. That's also good to understand. So these are this is just meant to give a little context and to show what exactly Joshua was dealing with in around 1177 when he invaded, and that's it for now. So next we're going to work on the timeline, the biblical timeline, and investigate a little bit quite conclusively why it doesn't work, the biblical timeline, and how we can repair it.